Hey everyone, in this three-part lesson, I'm going to be going over all of the common tactics in chess. In this part, I'll be focusing on the more elementary tactics for beginners, and then in the next two parts, I'll be talking more about advanced tactics for those who aren't beginners. So if you aren't really that new to the game, then I would consider subscribing so you can get notified of when the next parts of this lesson come out. Now, if you're a beginner, that doesn't mean you can't watch these videos. It's just going to be a little bit more harder to understand. But right now, let's just focus on the basics. So here, I'll be going over four of the most common and basic chess tactics, are the pin, discovery, fork, and skewer. In each of them, I'll kind of explain what they are, and then give a couple examples so you can practice yourself. Okay, so the first tactic I'm going to be going over is called the pin. And the pin is when you attack a lower value piece and it cannot move because it would have a threat on a higher value piece. So what I mean by that is, let's say bishop comes out to g5. This would be a pin on the knight because if the knight were to move, it would reveal an attack on a higher value piece, which is the queen in this case. And now there's two types of pins. There's one called a relative, and then there's another called the absolute pin. And here is a relative pin because the knight can still move actually, right? It can move to here or here. It would just be a terrible move because you'd lose the queen, but it can still do that. On the other hand, you have an absolute pin, which is more like this. So if the queen slides over to here, right, what happens is the knight actually can't move because of the threat that would exist on the king if it did. And the king, is the most valuable piece. So if you, move this knight, then if you were to move the knight, you would just take the king. So that's why it's called an absolute pin. The knight just cannot move anywhere. So here's another example. So here is another relative pin, right? So if my rook comes up to h6, this bishop cannot move, right? Now it could, but you just lose the knight, right? So it's pinned, but it's not like it's under threat or anything. Like you're not just going to take it because you lose the rook. So this is a relative pin again, right? Because piece cannot move because of threat on another piece that exists. Keep in mind that pins don't always win you material. This is often a positional tactic, right? It's less of a tactic that wins you the game. But think about this, right? When you pin this, right, it's applying some sort of pressure to this knight. It can't move, right? And it's applying pressure to your opponent, right? They're thinking about this, pin on their knight, right? And it can be, lead to some complicated situations. But the idea is it's a positional move that, hinders your enemy's, movement. So here I have a couple of examples. This is the first one, and I'm just going to give a move, and you're going to tell me what that best move is in response. So here, let's say black plays rook to e4. Could you tell me what move here wins? Okay, so the move here, as going with the theme of pins, is bishop d3, lining up this absolute pin on the king. Now this is a pin that wins material because the rook cannot move anywhere, and since it's a higher value piece than the bishop, you're probably just going to take it, right? So there's nothing that can be done, right? If the king steps out, you just take, right? And there's no way to defend the rook, right? If you come up here, it's just a trade, and you just up a rook. So clearly this is, a pin can be very powerful if it's, pinning something to the king. So you always got to be looking out for, some sort of pins on the king and pins on just pieces in general, right? So here is another example, right? It's with a relative pin, and after the move rook b2, you're going to tell me again what the move here is, relating to pins, of course. And the move here is bishop c4, so once again with a bishop. Now keep in mind, it doesn't have to be a bishop, it can also be a queen or a rook. That's always, doing the pinning. But here in this case, it's the bishop again, lining this relative pin. The knight cannot move, right? Because if it moves, it would reveal a higher value piece behind it, right? The queen. And you just take the queen, you just be up a queen. Now, keep in mind, with this relative pin, it can be dangerous, right? For example, if my king was, let's say, here, for example, or not there, but because the rook checks there, but here, right, on this edge, right? the knight could come over here and check me, right? And then it could take the bishop, right? And I would, you know, that's not a good thing. So you always got to be lookout on if the enemy can move and create a threat on, the piece that's here or your king. So you always got to be looking for things like that when you do relative pins, because you can put yourself at some risk when you think that, oh, their pieces are just pinned, right? You can, kind of make a mistake here. So that's pins. Very simple and very super common, positional tactic. This is one that I recommend thinking about, and this is more on the side of not blundering this. You want to make sure you realize that this is pinned, because oftentimes at a beginner stage, people are going to forget this is pinned, right? So let's say, he plays, here, right here, and after something like this, some people will think that, oh, I just take this knight, and then they lose the queen. So as a beginner, it's very common for this to happen. Happens to a lot of people, happens to everyone probably. So you just gotta always be on the lookout when you do some sort of relative pin. The next tactic I'm going to be going over in this beginner guide is the fork. Now this is probably the most common tactic that will win you games. You've probably already lost to it like tons of times or won because of it, but I'm just going to go over what it is and how to, spot it well. So it's often done at a beginner level with the knight, just because knights are really tricky to see when you first start the game. It's really hard to see where they're going to go. Now here, this is a very common opening at a beginner level called the fry liver. Highly recommend you check it out, because as a beginner this will happen a lot, so just be on the lookout for that. People will play this, and this is a fork. As you can see, it's a simultaneous attack between two or more pieces, and you're going to win one of them, right? So here in this case, clearly you have to save the queen, right? And the king can't take because the bishop protects, so the queen has to move, and then you would just take the rook. And so this is a fork. You can win so much material off of this. It's a very common tactic, and this is the one. And pin is like the positional one that happens a lot. This is the one that's like the winning material, winning the game sort of tactic. Now keep in mind that any piece can fork, so it's really crucial that you know where your pieces are attacking. So you just got to be aware of where your piece, right, can go and what it can attack at the same time. This is something that will improve as you play the game, but just keep it in mind, and you'll slowly get it down. Alright, so I have some examples here. The first one is after the move Queen e6. Can you find a sort of forking move that could win you some material? And here, if you found the move, that move is d5, pushing this pawn up, and as you can see, it's attacking two things at once. And a fork is also known as a double attack for this reason, right? Think about this, you're attacking two pieces. But as you calculate this part, after knight d4, what do you do here? He's attacking your queen, but you're also attacking his. So what do? Well, you can take this queen, because if the knight takes you, then you just take with the bishop, and you're up a piece, right? So you just have to be aware of these things, that just because, you're attacking two things, doesn't mean that you're going to win them. They might have some sort of tactic that can, complicate things. Okay, so that was the first example. Here's the second one. Can you find the forking move after queen b5? And here the move is knight d6 check, right? You're forking the king and the queen. And just to note that when you fork the king, it has to move because it's the most valuable piece, right? If it didn't have to move, then you just take it, and they don't have a king. So super common idea, and I highly recommend that you practice these. Now, as a beginner player, it's going to be really difficult spotting forks. Don't worry about that. As you play more and more games, you will naturally see forks. So what I recommend for you to do is actually just play the game. The more you play, you're going to be more accustomed to seeing this tactic, and then you'll start defending against it. You'll start seeing if your opponent can do it, and so just play, right? You don't have to, do puzzles or studying. Those will, of course, help you, but the main idea is that you'll see these from playing the game. Okay, so those were the two big tactics that I want to go over in this video, and now we'll go over two more, starting with the discovery. Alright, so the discovery is when you move a piece, it clears the way for another piece to attack something. Now, this tactic is extremely powerful because it allows you to attack multiple pieces at once, similar to a fork. So here, the knight can, move to e3, attacking this queen, right? Now, normally, the queen would just move out of the way and be fine. But this is a discovery because the bishop now discovers the king here and is attacking it, right? Before, the bishop was not attacking it because of the knight blocking it. But now, with this, the bishop sees the king and the knight sees the queen. So it's similar to a sort of fork. Now, this is an absolute discovery, right? Similar to an absolute pin. The king has to move or, block the attack somehow, right? And there's, of course, relative discoveries where you're, attacking a piece here rather than the king, right? And they don't have to move the piece, right? Similar to relative pins, right? It's just that, you're attacking it and they're probably going to have to move it. So let's go on to some examples. Alright, so after queen goes to b6, what move here wins for white? The move is knight to c4, right? So this creates an attack on the queen while opening a discovered attack on this knight. And the thing is, there's no way for this queen to come back and defend this knight, right? So what happens is the queen moves, and then you take the knight, and you just up a knight. Alright, on to example number 2. Here, black plays knight takes b4, check, right? So what do you do here? Well, this one's a relatively easy one. You just play king c3, attacking the knight and attacking the bishop. So these are things you just have to keep in mind, right? When you're seeing undefended pieces do some stuff, and then you can attack it and then create another threat, right? That's what a discovery is. So here the knight comes here, you come down with the king, attacking it once again, and there's no way for black to defend both the bishop and the knight at the same time. The final tactic I'll be talking about today is called the skewer. And you can think of the skewer as the opposite of a pin. So what happens is a piece goes and attacks a high value piece. And when that high value piece moves, it reveals an attack on another piece, right? So in this case, the rook is under attack and the bishop is worth less than the rook. So you just take it and you're winning here. This tactic is more of a win material tactic. And it's very tricky to actually see because you have to have very good board vision. So if you want to be able to spot forks easily, like the fork, I just recommend you to just play the game and improve your board vision bit by bit so you can just get better at spotting these tactics. Because if you know where the queen moves, right, and you have these, sight lines in your head and stuff, you're going to be able to see the tactics better. And like with other tactics, just keep in mind that sometimes they might have, another tactic that gets them out of a pin, right? So maybe he'll check you or something with the queen, and then he can get out with his rook. So just be on the lookout for that. Alright, so let's move on to some examples. Here, after queen to e5, where is the skewer here? The skewer here is on queen h8. And the reason is because the king leaves the defense of the queen because it has to move, right? So if it moves here, takes the queen, moves here, takes the queen. So like I said, if you have better board vision, you're going to be able to see this very quickly. And if you saw this check, I will say this, that you are doing very good with your board vision. Just keep on playing, keep on practicing, and you will get there. You'll be able to see these tactics instantly, and that's when you become an intermediate player. Anyways, I have another example here, continuing this sort of skewer practice. So after queen c6, what move here wins for white? The move here is bishop f3. Now this attacks the queen and skewers it because there's a knight behind it. Now, when the queen moves to f6, what do you do here? Now, here you actually don't want to take with the bishop, because once you do that, the queen will take your rook, and this is just losing here. So you want to take with your rook, right? And you'll see this if you have better board vision. If you saw this, you're on the path to becoming intermediate player, right? You just have to be able to, constantly see these without having to think really hard about it. Alright, so that concludes my beginner tactic guide, and soon I will upload the next part to this lesson, which is the intermediate guide. It will go over 7 intermediate tactics. Now, if you're not an intermediate player, don't worry, okay? You can still watch these tactics because they will still happen in your games. It's just that it's going to be a lot harder to see as a beginner player. So, in order to improve on these tactics that I just showed, I said in the video multiple times, just play the game. And once you get to the point where you can recognize them, without having to think really hard about it, you'll just see them, right? That's when you transition to an intermediate player. And that's where I think you can comfortably watch my intermediate guide and the advanced guide, which will complete the tactic lesson. Now, just so you know, this does not cover every single tactic. I will just be covering the most common ones. Okay, there are some really nuanced tactics that don't happen often and aren't really super important, so I won't be covering those. Alright, that's it from me. If you want to learn more free lessons, then consider subscribing. It greatly helps me out, and if you have any feedback for me, then drop a comment below, and I'll do my best to respond. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you back for the intermediate guide.